So I think there's one fundamental weakness in the Eastern traditions and one fundamental weakness in Western science. So the biggest problem with Western science is that it doesn't work for people. I know that sounds weird, but literally what I mean is when we do a study on neuroscience, we are learning about the average brain. We're not learning about your brain. This is why we have clinicians, because the science doesn't translate to a person. It requires a human being who understands the science of medicine, and then they have to tailor what works or what doesn't work for you. So each patient with their doctor walks an individual journey of applying scientific principles. And remember, science is about the average, right? So gravity is like universal. Similarly, like if we look at like what parts of the brain do what, those are general rules. So you require a tailoring down. This is why I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding in the world today that we're all learning about science, but we don't realize that even if you understand neuroscience, it's not going to teach you about your brain. It's going to teach you about the average brain. So there's a gap in translation. That's literally why we see that even if we understand something about neuroscience, if you explain that concept to someone, they can't DIY it directly in their life. So if we sort of look at the Eastern traditions, that's exactly what they did, right? And I think one of the best ways to understand this is, so like Freud, for example, had no way to look inside someone's mind. So he would sit with another person, he would listen to their words, and he would use their words to infer what is going on in someone's mind. But I'm sure you know that there's a difference between what you say and what you think, right? There's like a huge gap there. So that's sort of what the Eastern contemplative practices did. A yogi sits in the Himalayas, doesn't talk to anyone, and he has the one tool that can actually observe the mind. You can observe your mind. I don't even know if you have thoughts. I don't know if everyone listening out there could be bots. And if y'all are watching us on the internet or whatever, like I could be an AI, like there's no way of you knowing, right? So the fundamental problem with mind is that the West has no way to detect it. We have no way to measure it. And Western science is all about measurement. So we have to be able to track things, blood tests, x-rays, whatever. So in the East, we have the one direct way to observe mind, which is internally. So that's why Eastern contemplative practice is all DIY, right? No one else can do it for you. If you come to my office, I can therapize you as a psychiatrist. I can do surgery. I mean, I'm not going to do surgery on you, but a doctor can do surgery. So Western science is about doing things to you. Eastern contemplative practices are all about doing things yourself. But there's a big problem, because if anyone who makes a claim about Eastern contemplative practices says something, you have no idea if they're right or wrong, right? So you have no way of measuring whether someone who makes a claim, if it's like BS or not, right? Because there's not like a Western apparatus to verify whether something is successful or not successful. So over on the West, we can verify things, but everything is general. Nothing is tailored to you. And over on the Eastern side, we have a lot of practices, but which ones work well? Do they work? Do they not work? Do they work better? Do they not work as good? And I see this as a huge problem when people engage with spiritual traditions, because if you go to an ashram or something, or you go to a teacher and you have difficulty doing a practice, does that mean that you need to try harder, or that the practice doesn't work, or that the practice isn't suited to you? We have no way of really knowing. And the one thing that I always found shocking is that I'd almost never encountered a guru who works with like a disciple and says, you know what, I'm not the best suited for you. You should go learn from somebody else. Like I have a recommendation. We do that all the time in medicine. You should go see my friend who's like an orthopedic surgeon and like he can take care of you. But there's no like referral systems in the guru system. There's no referral systems within gurus, right? So what that ends up meaning is that a lot of people who walk Eastern paths are not actually like on the right path for them. And then they sort of say things like, oh, meditation doesn't work for me. Well, maybe you should have a different teacher or use a different kind of practice. And there's a whole like mechanism and like science behind that, which most people I think don't know or understand or teach.
Yeah, there is this pedestalization of the intellect and logic throughout all, more and more of the world, I would say, but obviously Western side of things. And I've heard you speak to this distinction between Vidya and Gyan and how it's important to understand the difference between the two because they're not the same, and yet we conflate information as knowledge, as wisdom. And so how do you kind of distinct between the experiential knowing that we can have, gnosis in the body, versus what we can empirically validate and information and knowledge in the external world?
Yeah, so it's a great point, and I love Sanskrit because there's this apocryphal saying that Eskimos have 100 words for snow. So anytime you have a culture that understands something very well, they will have a very sophisticated language for it. So what I love about Sanskrit is I think it is the most sophisticated language for describing subjective experience. So even like the word meditation, for example, is like one word in English, but it gets translated over to at least a dozen, if not more words in the Sanskrit language. So you mentioned Vidya and Nyan, and I think it's a fantastic thing to start with. So these are both words that get translated as knowledge in some way, but I would say that Vidya is information and Nyan is understanding. So information is objective, is transmissible. So if I tell you like, my car is parked over there, like you can sort of, and you don't really know that, but I can transmit it. It's also, so it's objective and it's transmissible. Nyan is subjective and non-transmissible. Now, the tricky thing is that in the West, we value Vidya over Nyan. We say like, unless you can prove it to me, I don't care, right? So like, that's why science is so big. The big advantage of science is that it's verifiable. But I think the shortcoming is if we look at information, information doesn't change behavior and it doesn't change your life. I can tell you, hey, you should stop eating hamburgers. It's bad for your cholesterol. And I've tried. I worked as an addiction psychiatrist for a while. I still arguably do. And like explaining to patients that this is bad for you does not elicit change. So Nyan is what changes a person, but it's untransmissible, which is the whole problem. Like that's why we train psychiatrists, because even if I've walked my own journey, I can't like upload that to your brain. And so that's sort of the dichotomy. I think Nyan is actually a lot more valuable. That's what we kind of call understanding, right? You can have, I run into this quite a bit where there's like MBAs who have a degree but don't understand like how to run a company. So that's the difference between like Vidya and Nyan.
What is the difference between someone's disposition, I guess, and somebody who understands a concept and puts it into practice versus where it stays in the intellect and doesn't have the capacity to be integrated? Because I've heard you speak to how like a book will say information, but it's awakening what's the knowledge you already have within you, in a sense, would be Gyan.
So I guess the practical problem that I run into a lot is how do you take information and create change? So the moment that you have Nyan, the moment that you understand something, you have no choice but to change, right? So like if I take a 5-year-old, and I remember one time I was eating sushi with my kids and they had never had wasabi before. And like they see this green paste and they're like, oh, this is green tea ice cream. Like this is delicious. And I'm like, no, it is not green tea ice cream. And they're like, no, but it's like, it smells good. And like, so, they want to eat it. And so obviously like she's like took her spoon and I didn't let her eat it. I was like, okay, just taste a little bit. And the beautiful thing about wasabi is you can see information turn into understanding if you watch a child try wasabi for the first time. Because the first second it touches your lips, you're like, what are you talking about, bro? And then it sort of hits the back of your head, if you, that's what it does for me. And then it's like, oh my God, I'm so glad. And they're like, kind of like, it's wild for them. So if we sort of think about it, information doesn't change behavior. And the moment that you have experience, the moment that you have Nyan, you cannot not change. So once the child has tried wasabi, if I give them a spoonful, they're not going to eat it, right? Everything, the way that they treated wasabi before experience and the way that they treat it afterward is completely transformed. That is the value of Nyan. Now, if we can also talk about other examples of this. So like my favorite thing is like love. So especially nowadays, people are struggling to like date and stuff, and everyone has these ideas of what relationships are. They have all this information, especially driven by like social media and short form content about what you should be and how the other person should be. And they have all these ideas about what a relationship is. And once you actually experience love, once you experience a healthy relationship, you know what it is and you know what it isn't. So information is something that's transmissible. Once you understand something, there's change that can't be avoided. Now, the question really becomes, how do I move from one to the other, right? So I can read 1,000 books on meditation. It doesn't make me enlightened. I can also use an app for 10 years. It doesn't make me enlightened. So how does that transmission happen? I think there are two mechanisms. We can sort of look at the Western mechanism and the Eastern mechanism. So the Western mechanism, so we know that the moment you manipulate information is like how we get understanding of it. So literally the parts of your brain that encode information. So when I say something to you, it's going to enter through your sensory, it's going to enter through your ears, go to your auditory cortex, go to your hippocampus, which is where your short-term memory lives. So you're like, okay, like I kind of get this. That memory gets consolidated and really integrated into your brain when you start to manipulate it. So what I'll tell people is like, don't memorize. I work with a lot of people who have ADHD and struggle to like study and things like that. So don't like memorize information. What you need to do is play around with it. And what we sort of notice is if there's anything in your life that you play around with, right? So if you really love food, for example, and you play around with cooking, you're going to understand it way better than a cookbook can teach you. So it's really the manipulation of information, the organization of information, which is why I think this is terrible. But, there's a trend nowadays for people to summarize. Like, I read 10 books on business habits. Here's the TLDR. That's going to go right into your short-term memory, and it's going to get wiped when you go to bed. You have to play around with it to really learn it and understand it. That's sort of the Western perspective. So the Eastern is where things get weird, okay? So from the Eastern perspective, what I have really discovered and what I think is true is that there's this, okay, we're going to go off the rails from like a scientific perspective, okay? So there's this like collective unconscious that has all of the understanding of everything. And it's so interesting because what I'm about to say is going to sound crazy, but I encourage people to really pay attention to what I'm saying and study it for themselves. So what I realized a long time ago, so I'm kind of like a scientific by nature. And one of the things that always confused me is if I read a book, why don't I understand it? Right? So if my mind scans words on a page and I do that once, it doesn't stick. If I do it twice, it doesn't stick. If I do it 3 times, it doesn't stick. But there are other times where I read it once and it does stick. So if the information is really in the book, I should be able to read it and then I should know it. But that's not what happens. So what really happens is the stuff on the page, and if you read a book, and you'll notice that you kind of get it. It triggers something within you. The understanding doesn't exist you can't have understanding in a book, like literally. Because if the understanding was in the book, anyone who read it would get the understanding. You can have information in a book. But the understanding comes from within you. And the book serves as a trigger for your internal understanding. Now it clicks. We even have subjective, experiences that we'll describe, like the light bulb went off. It clicked for me. So clicking is Nyan. And then once you understand that, okay, hold on a second, this understanding comes from within me, then we can really experiment with it. So now the question becomes, what are the circumstances that allow things to click for me more? And this is really when you get into contemplative practice, and there's certain practices that you do that will have things click for you more. And then you can discover a couple of other things. The first is that stuff can click for you without you reading anything. So if you've ever been creative, if you've ever like woken up one day and you're like, oh, this is what's going on, right? So that doesn't come from an external trigger. It comes from somewhere within you. And then through that process of experimentation, and I tried a lot of different practices and things like that, what I now the understanding that I have is there's like a conduit between you and Brahman, which is the cosmic consciousness. And the more that conduit opens, the more access to that information that you have. And when you read a book, if you're distracted, your conduit to Brahman is weak, right? So it's not there. Attention is critical for the conduit to Brahman. And so once that conduit is open, it's like I'm plugging in my Ethernet cord and now I'm connected to the internet. So now it like clicks for me. And literally what I'll do is, I work with all kinds of people, degenerate gamers, but also like CEOs of very successful startups and things like that. And the more that I've found that they can connect to Brahman when I teach them those kinds of contemplative practice, their like understanding of things and their performance in the real world like drastically improves.